Getting ready to put the 9mm
Sew into
material
this corresponding position on E.
and then sew this whole loop of thread. Then measure the thread before you sew it. Measure the length
Pull
of the thread for 10 times the length of this straight line. For example, here is 1, 2, 3, and go on. Here 10 times is enough. Both ends of the thread need to be threaded with needles. Pass the thread through the eye of the needle first. Then pull out a small piece of thread. The tip of the needle goes straight through the center of the pulled out section of the thread. It's like this. Then pull the short thread through the eye of the needle. Just tighten the long thread again. Do the same on the other side. Once the needle is threaded, you can start sewing. In the first stitch is from this hole. It's this one hole right here next to the straight line. Start sewing here. We'll put the needle through the first hole here. Equal distribution on both thread. And then this needle at the bottom. Go up through the second hole. Swing the thread to the upper left at a 45-degree angle. The top needle is threaded down through the second hole. After completing a crossover, tighten the two threads. Repeat this step for the rest of the program. Notice the needle coming up from the bottom. First your thread swinging at this angle, later placed at this angle. Don't come over here. Swing towards a unity of purpose. It's the only way to get a nice straight stitches. Well, what about the stitching? That's all for now. How do we add item 9mm material here I'll teach it again. Let's go ahead and finish this section by ourselves. After sewing this straight section of 9, let's add material E. First of all, we have this needle down here. One more stitch to the front here. From the bottom to top. And then just put it right on top of E. Align the holes. This one needle up here. Attach E as you go down. The corresponds hole. Attach the no E corresponding hole. And then continue with normal stitches. Notice our last hole here below. After sewing the needle next to this one, when the needle goes through, straight through the center of E and 9. It's like this right down the middle. You don't need to get it through to the bottom of E. And then we'll do it the same way we did before. Normal stitches. Okay. What about this straight line here?
Do it.
Sew it. And then here,
I'll
show you how to connect to it again. After sewing this straight section, the needle down here, thread it up through this hole. And then when that needle up there goes down, add material E. And then continue with normal stitches. Okay, we're sewing the last hole here. Directly backstitch 2 stitches to finish it. Put the thread to the same side. It's like this. Then cut the thread. When you're cutting waxed thread, cut it clean here. Get the glue again. When you open the glue, just take these scissors and poke it right here. Then find an card or container. Drop the glue in it. Because the glue drops on a flat surface can't be cleaned off. That's why the glue can't be operated directly on the material. Then take a spare needle or toothpick. Dip a little glue. Apply a small amount to the top of the knot. Then the first step is done. After you finish the stitches, let's take 2 nuts and 2 bolts. And then load it into this place. We're snapping the knot from top to bottom. And then the screws underneath. Just do the same on the other side. Sew the 2 bar. Sew the bar to this corresponding position on the EMI material. And here's what it looks like
You
when
can check
it's all
that.
sewn up. Here's the length of the
It's
thread.
5
times the length of this straight line. Pull the line and measure it. After threading the
You're
needle,
ready
to start stitching. What about the sewing method?
It's the same as before.
I'll show you a few stitches here. please sew it. The rest, just go and sew it. When sewing the last hole, backstitch 2 stitches to finish. Good to finish sewing the last hole. Backstitch 2 stitches to finish it off. After you cut the wax thread, have the glue on it. We're done with this step. And the other side, it works the same way. Separate the 2 chi through the buttons. And then sew this line. Here's what it looks like when it's done. Let's take a look. Then when you install it, pay attention to. We have this one with the pin buckle facing up. When you hold it, it's facing up like this. And then we've got the chi. Pinch it through. And then put it on like this. Fold it like this. This pin buckle is facing up. And then measure the thread length. That's 4 times the length of the line. If you're worried about not having enough thread, 2 times as much. It's okay to have more thread. The thread are sufficient in the package. After measuring the thread and you're ready to start stitching. What about the sewing method? It's the same as what we learned earlier. I'm going to show you a few stitches. Be sure to keep the angle of putting the thread. Here we go. That's all I'm going to sew for now. When sews the last hole here. Just backstitch 2 stitches to finish. Finish sewing the last hole. Finish sewing the last hole. Backstitch 2 stitches to finish. Then draw the threads to the same side. Cut the wax thread. Have the glue. Then this step is done. What about the other side? It's made the same way. You can see that. This is what it looks like when it's all sewn up. It's like this. Layer 2R and 2-3. Then sew this section. Measure the thread. Here is a straight line twice as long as this one. And this one is twice the length of this straight line. Just pull the thread. Measure the thread and we're ready to start stitching. We're only sewing the center row of holes. The stitching is the same as before. Okay, we're done sewing all the holes. Directly backstitch 2 stitches to finish. Okay, so we're done with this step. And then these other two components. It works the same way. Just sew this straight section alone. Separate the two loops through the square buckle. Then sew it to this part of R. Here's what it looks like
You
when
can
it's
check
all
it.
sewn up. The thread. How about the length? It's just double the length of this section and that's enough. That's twice as much. Then thread the needle. Then you can follow the stitching method you learned earlier. Keep stitching. I'm going to show you a couple of stitches, and then you can just go and sew the stitches by yourself. Finish sewing all the holes. Directly backstitch 2 stitches to finish. Alright, let's just backstitch here. Put the threads on the same side. Cut it, and have the glue on it. Then we are done with this step. Next, sew the sun component to the inside of the S, above the corresponding position of this circle of holes. Then sew this loop. Notice how the holes are aligned here. The first hole on the sun, the right one is the second hole in S. Pay attention to it. Here is a hole that needs to be left empty to lock the edge. And what about the thread length here? That's 7 times the length of this straight line. Pull the thread and measure and thread the needle. We're ready to start stitching. We'll start with the first hole. Be sure to note the first hole in sun. The right one is the second hole in S. Then go on. Sew it. Just keep stitching. I'm going to show you a few stitches. I'm not going to record the steps that I'm going to repeat. If you have any questions, please contact us. Okay. This circle in the back, sew it. Then you should pay attention to when you sew this bend. Make sure you keep the thread tight. Notice the position here. Here the holes are all 1 to 1. He'll cover the half hole a little bit here, but there are corresponding holes underneath as well. Don't make a mistake here. Let's finish sewing the last 2 holes, then backstitch 2 stitches to finish. Note that there is also an extra hole here at the end. After backstitching, put the thread directly to the seam side. Cut the thread and have the glue. And then we're done with this one step. Sew the wool to the other side of the sun. And then the way to the material looks like this. Pay attention to this place. It's the first hole to the first hole. And then thread length is 7 times the length of this segment. The length of the thread is the same length as just here. Pull on a thread. After measuring the thread and threading the needle, we started sewing. First of all, the first stitch here is the one that needs to be hemmed. We'll start by threading the needle through the first hole. Then the 2 threads are divided equally on the bottom needle. This goes around the top. A needle goes around the top like this. Thread it down through the first hole in the round hole bit. Then we'll tighten the line. When pulling it, it's this thread that's going to be locked on. Like this. What happens after you tighten it up? This is where you finish locking the edges. Let's continue to follow the stitching method we learned earlier. Just keep stitching. I'm going to show you a few stitches. When sewing it, keep an eye on this edge to make sure it's aligned. Or if it's convenient for you, you can also take a dovetail clip to hold it in place. Well, I'll show you. And then the rest of this big circle here. When it's time, you'll need to lock the edges here to finish. I'll teach you later. Something to keep in mind here at the turn. Tighten the line. Just pay attention to the alignment of the holes here. Finish sewing the last hole. Let's lock the edges. The bottom needle goes around the top like this. Go down through the first round hole here. Then tighten the thread. And here's where the edge locking is complete. And then just backstitch 2 stitches. Cut the thread and have glue. Then we are done with this step. What about when we're done sewing the whole bag? We need to be inside this bag. Put some stuff in it. Stylize it. Then this place won't be dented. Next, take the army material sewn to on the back of E in this corresponding position. And sew the stitches. Looks like this. Sew this whole circle. Length of the 2 threads. That's 8 times the length of this section. Just pull it. When align them. Same thing. The first hole in R, the right one is the second hole in E. Here you need to leave 1 stitch free to lock the edges. Measure the thread and thread the needle and you can start stitching. How to make it? It's the same as the one in the 324. I'll show you a few stitches here. And then the steps are repeated. Go ahead and sew it. Well, you can just go and stitch this back circle by yourself and then pay special attention to the corners. Be sure to keep the thread tight. And if there's a slight misalignment, just make sure you align the holes. Just come to the stitching line 1 hole at a time, one by one. Let's finish sewing the last few holes. Directly backstitch 2 stitches to finish. Cut the thread and have glue. Then we are done with this step. Next, take this 4. Stitch into R. Corresponding position. And then note here that the way the material is aligned like this. Here the first hole to the first hole. The stitching is exactly the same as here. And the length of the 2 threads. That's 8 times the length of this straight line. Just pull the thread. Then once the thread is threaded, we can start sewing. Then we'll fix the material first. The first stitch here needs to be hemmed through the first hole. Equal the all threads. Needle at the bottom goes around the top, threaded down through the first hole in the round hole. Then tighten the thread. After that, finish locking the edges. Go on to follow the stitching method learned previously. Just keep going and sewing. And then here I'll show you a couple of stitches. Done. What about the whole circle? Just keep going to the stitches. Then finish sewing the last hole and lock the edges to finish. Let's finish sewing these holes. And then left to finish. The needle below goes around the top. Then from the first round hole downwards. Once you've tightened it, there's a locking edge here. Then backstitch twice. Cut it. Have glue on it. Okay, we're done with the bag. And when you're done, stuff the bag. Stylize it. Get some newspapers, or maybe some clothes will do. Then we'll put on the magnetic clasp. Next we'll install the straps. There are holes on both ends of shoulder straps. Let's fold it in half like this. Snap it to this square button here. Like this. And then we have the nut underneath. That's a screw up there. Screw it up. The other side does the same thing. Then we'll just put the straps back on and we're done. Adjust it to your own height. And then our bag is done. Thanks for watching.